teaching skills and language awareness, teaching grammar to adults and young learners. These are the objectives of this input today and are examples of the kinds of specific, clear, and measurable objectives that you'll be writing in your own lesson plans. However, the difference is, of course, you'll be teaching English, so you'll also have to include examples of the target language you'll want your students to be better able to use by the end of the lesson. So today's objectives for you are to be able to give examples of use and form of selected grammar structures, describe the difference between inductive and deductive grammar teaching, describe the difference between controlled and freer practice, and give examples of activities, and to be able to list the basic staging for adult and young learner grammar lessons. So the first thing, discuss with your group or partner, what do we need to consider when we teach language? Pause the video and take about 3 to 4 minutes to talk about this now. When we teach any kind of language, we need to consider the context the language is used in, what the target language means and how it's used, its pronunciation, and its form. In other words, its grammatical structure, or what it looks like. So, what do we need to consider when we teach grammar? Well, learners need to be able to do the following. Recognize and understand the structure when they see or hear it. Remember and recall it when they need to use it. They need to use it with the correct meaning and know when to use it in the right situation. They should know how to use it with the right register. Some structures are more formal or informal, polite or less polite, and students need to know when it's appropriate to use one or the other. They'll need to pronounce it clearly and naturally, and they'll need to use the correct written form in a sentence. For children, they learn language patterns rather than grammar rules. They remember and reproduce what they have heard many times. So, what is the best way to introduce and practice grammatical structures? Well, first we need to talk a bit about form and use. Our students need to be aware of the form of our TL, target language. In other words, what it looks like. Have a look at the picture on this slide. From this, can you answer the questions in the yellow box? What part of speech is woof? And how do you know? You probably said it's a verb. And how do you know this? Because of its form. Just like all verbs, it takes S, ing, and ed endings. We also want our students to be aware of these grammatical structures and rules, so it's important we know these ourselves. So here's a quick exercise. Think of the present continuous tense. A couple of example sentences are, you're watching a video. She's cooking. They're cleaning the house. With your partner or group again, pause the video and talk about what the form is for the present continuous. Don't forget to think about negatives and questions as well. Go. The present continuous tense is formed with the subject plus the present participle form, ing, of the main verb, and the present simple tense of the verb to be, am, is, are. He is the subject. Is the present tense of the verb to be, and swimming is the present participle verb form. We can make this form negative by adding not after the verb to be, and to form a question, we invert the subject and the be verb. Did you get it right? So that was the form. Equally as important as what the target language looks like is also how it's used in natural communication. So we've looked at the form of the present continuous tense. Now let's look at its use. Well, it turns out it can be used in various situations and can describe an action in progress at the moment. I am recording the voiceover for this video. An action in progress around now. They're renovating the building next door. A temporary action. He's staying at the Ritz-Carlton. Or a future arrangement. She's meeting her sister later. With your group or partner, see if you can come up with your own example sentences for each different use of the present continuous. Pause the video and do this now. So, to answer question 1 on your task sheet, in relation to language, form relates to the grammatical structure or rules, whereas use is about when that target language is used in natural communication. So, if we're teaching the present continuous, we can see it has several possible uses. So we need to be very clear which context we are presenting to our learners and how we want them to use the present continuous in that particular lesson. It's unlikely you would cover more than one use in one lesson, as you might end up confusing them. It's best to keep the context contained within manageable learning parameters. So work with your partner or group for this exercise, which is task 2 on your task sheet. First, identify the tense and underline the verb form. Define what the use is of this particular structure. Let's do the first one together. Number 1, the sun sets in the west. So for the form, we usually, if it's a tense, underline the subject and the verb form. In this case, the sun sets, which is the present simple tense. So with a sentence like, the sun sets in the west, it's likely that the context we're using this in is for statements of fact that don't change. Pause the video now and do numbers 2 to 5 with your partner or group. Go. Here are the suggested answers. Compare them with your ideas. Something you'll hear a lot of with regard to grammar teaching is deductive or inductive approaches or reasoning. Deductive reasoning is essentially a top-down approach, which moves from the more general to the more specific. In other words, we start with a general notion or theory, which we then narrow down to specific hypotheses which are then tested. Inductive reasoning is more of a bottom-up approach, moving from the more specific to the more general, in which we make specific observations, detect patterns, formulate hypotheses, and draw conclusions. So what does this mean for our learners and how they learn language? First of all, pause the slide and decide which approach best matches these two definitions based on your own understanding and what you read on the previous slide. So hopefully, you all said the first definition was for an inductive approach, and the second for deductive. Thornbury describes a deductive approach as rule-driven, and starts with the presentation of a rule, and is followed by examples in which the rule is applied. Whereas an inductive approach is about rule discovery, and starts with some examples from which a rule is then inferred. Now, with your partner, do rock, paper, scissors. The loser must try and paraphrase the definitions of the inductive and deductive approaches. The winner should check if the loser is correct in their definitions or not. With your partner or group, have a look at this exercise on the slide, which is from a student workbook. Is this a deductive or inductive approach? Pause the video and have a guess. This one is deductive, because here the rules have been given. How about this one? Well, an example of the target language has been provided in a natural context. The task is for learners to think about the rules of when to add ER and when to use more when using comparatives. So it looks fairly inductive, although there is a deductive element with the grammar spot explicitly stating that regular comparative adjectives add ER or more. How about this one? This is a dialogue of how a lesson on the past perfect might go. You'll see this in your task sheet on page 4, and this is an example of a deductive approach to teaching grammar. Can you also see how high TTT is in this particular instance? This is one of the biggest drawbacks of the deductive approach. It's very teacher-centered. And what about this one? This looks like a fairly inductive task to me, where the students have to work out the rules in relation to the language by looking at how it is used in context. Now, have a look at your task sheet at questions 3 and 4. With your partner or group, answer the questions relating to deductive and inductive approaches to teaching grammar. With these two approaches, which one is better? They both have merits and drawbacks. We've listed a couple of advantages and disadvantages of the inductive approach, but see if you can come up with any more. Then, try to come up with advantages and disadvantages of deductive learning. Complete the table on page 2, question 5, as best you can, and then compare your answers with some suggested answers at the top of page 6. Whatever the approach, it's vital that in any lesson we include opportunities for the students to practice what they have learnt. So what makes a good practice activity? Pause the video and discuss this with your partner and group now. A good activity does the following. It meets the lesson objectives. It gives a lot of practice of the target language. It doesn't contain extra new words or grammar that was not previously learnt. The language sounds natural. It is meaningful and in context. It's communicative. It's learner-centered. And it's fun or motivating. Make sure you always give your students the opportunity to verbally practice the new language. Ensure you allow adequate time for this in the planning and execution of your lesson. You also need to ensure that the practice activities you've planned allow for meaningful communication, which gives them the incentive to use the target language, and are not so complicated that the activity takes more time to set up than the time taken to do the activity. Something that trainees often get confused about is the difference between controlled and freer practice in class. Have a look at these two tasks and decide if it is a controlled or free practice activity. Pause the video and discuss. Did you get it right? Controlled practice should be the following. It's designed to reinforce a specific language point and require a particular answer, so you know if the students are using the target language correctly. Using the language accurately is the aim, so you want to ensure you are closely monitoring the students at this stage. Repetition of the target language is important, so the more you can vary up interaction patterns, and a conveyor belt works really well for this, the better, which gives the students a chance to repeat the language but with many different partners. Error correction is often done during the activity so that students don't continue to repeat incorrect language. Some typical controlled practice activities might be gap fill worksheets, although try to involve some kind of interaction with this so that students are not just writing, or a find someone who task. Freer practice. The kinds of activities you do in free practice should give students more choice about the language they can use to complete the activity and express themselves. You want for them to get their message across and to speak more naturally and fluently, using the target language where appropriate. During free practice, error correction is often delayed because we don't want to keep interrupting students. This would impede their fluency. The kind of activities you can do are discussions, role plays, rankings, and class surveys. So, in the previous slide, comparing two mobile phones and discussing which you would buy and why is a more authentic activity and gives students a bit more freedom in deciding what to say, as opposed to a more controlled practice task. It's also somewhat personalized, as students can communicate their genuine preferences, ideas, and opinions. This personalized use of language is retained better in the long term, because it makes the language relevant to the learners, and communication is therefore more meaningful. So in your groups now, discuss these questions on the slide. A. Does controlled practice focus on accuracy or fluency? B. Does freer practice focus on accuracy or fluency? C. What exactly is being controlled? D. What roles does error correction play in controlled and freer practice? And E. Can you think of more examples of controlled and freer practice? Pause the video and allow yourselves about 3 to 5 minutes for this discussion. Have a look at question 6 in your task sheet. See if you can put the stages of a grammar lesson for adults in the right order. Pause the video and discuss this with your partner or group now. So, here are the stages. 1. Set context and create motivation. 2. Provide a student-centered task, which includes the target language, in a reading or listening passage. Ask for brief feedback on meaning. So it's not just for looking at the language, but also, do the students actually comprehend what that task is? 3. Students identify and draw conclusions about use and form. 4. Ask for feedback on the use and form. Ask concept check questions and try to get further examples. 5. Drill pronunciation and form. 6. Provide controlled practice. During these activities, you will monitor and error correct. Do a brief feedback session at the end. 7. Provide freer activation. Monitor and note common errors. Brief feedback focusing on meaning should take place after the activity. And 8. List common errors on the board and ask students to correct them. You may remember from the error correction input that it's important you try to keep even the error correction stage as student-centered as possible. Work in groups for this. Look at tasks A, B, and C from this student coursebook. Which stage does each one correspond to? And by stage, I mean the staging of the grammar lesson that we've just looked at. So go ahead and match A, B, and C to the stages. Pause the video and do this now. So A corresponds to stage 2, providing a student-centered task and getting brief feedback on meaning. B corresponds to stage 3, drawing attention to the target language. And C also corresponds to 3, where students have to identify the use. Memorize the staging. While we don't expect you to do this right now, try to memorize the staging from a grammar lesson, as this will help you instinctively when you're in the classroom conducting one. This recommended staging follows a logical flow and pattern, and if done right with the appropriate tasks, provides the best possible scaffolding for students to learn and practice the target language. This staging will be demonstrated in the live guided observation presenting language lesson during the face-to-face component. So, what are the main points when teaching young learners? A grammar lesson, a Lexis lesson, or any kind of lesson? You all know this already, but they should be motivating, varied, relevant, and of course, fun. So for question 7 on page 5 of your task sheet, work with a partner or your group to put the stages of teaching grammar to young learners in the right order. You'll be doing this mostly out of instinct at this point. Pause the video and do this now. So here's the correct staging. The staging as per your handbook is a little bit more elaborate, but roughly corresponds to the same staging here. We advise you to use the recommended staging as per this video, which we feel is more straightforward and user-friendly for our trainees. The handbook will be updated and re-uploaded to follow this staging. Now let's look at each stage in more detail. As I'm sure most of you already do, you might want to start your lesson with a quick, lively activity to get the children's interest and to introduce the topic. This will help to activate the students' schemata and think of related language that they already know. You could do this by singing a song, or showing pictures, or telling a quick story. Number 2, understand meaning in context. Present the new language in a natural context that makes the meaning of that language clear. You can create an imaginary situation in the classroom where the target language is used naturally. For example, have learners line up in a bus queue and talk about what they're wearing, what they do, where they're going, etc. Pictures, flashcards, and objects always help learners understand meaning. So for example, talk about what people like and don't like using happy or sad faces. Use puppets or soft toys and have them do funny and memorable things. Children enjoy making up silly names and giving characters a personality. He gets up at 6:03. He brushes his teeth. He combs his green hair, and so on. Puppets or toys can dramatize the language and really bring it to life. They're also useful and memorable when you're teaching prepositions. Let the students give the soft toy or puppet a name and take turns to put it in various places around the classroom. A text or a story can make the meaning of the target language clear, especially for older learners, and is even better if accompanied by pictures. 3. Identify the target language. You then need to draw the learner's attention to the target language, in other words, the words that make up the structure. It's best to get the students to identify the language by pointing to the words on the board as you say them, listen and point, repeating the language in the situation, listen and say, doing the actions as they hear them, listen and do, highlighting the language in the text, and other learners can discover the language and rules from meaning, use, and form here. Four, check understanding of the target language. Asking the question, "Do you understand?" will not give us any useful answers. The children might be embarrassed to say that they don't understand, or they may think that they do, but they actually have the wrong idea. So we need to ask concept check questions to check understanding. These can be, for example, WH questions. How often does he take a shower? To check their understanding of the present simple. Yes or no questions. Is he sleeping now? For the present continuous. Or either or questions. Is the mouse on or under the table? For prepositions. Number 5, learn the spoken form. Next, you need to teach the spoken form. Children learn to speak before they learn to read and write. The spoken form means how it sounds and how it's said. Model the structure by saying it clearly and naturally. Have learners listen and repeat. Drill the structure in a sentence so that the language starts to take on some aspect of automaticity. Use chants and stories where learners hear and say the words, which helps with their phonological awareness. Have them practice a structured dialogue in pairs or groups and act it out. If you want your learners to be able to write the form, this comes next. The written form means the parts that make up the structure. For example, am doing for the present continuous. Try to elicit this from the students and write it up on the board or interactive whiteboard. Use colors to highlight the parts, such as he likes snakes, with the S in likes in one color to indicate verb form, and S in snakes to indicate plural, highlighted in a different color. Have learners record the written form or make class displays that are easy to refer to. 7. Practice. Students need lots of opportunities to practice the new language in pairs and groups. Begin with more controlled activities and then move on to freer, more natural practice. Actions and mime help to get the class involved. You can have learners listen and mime their morning routines to practice the present simple, or guess each other's. Also, seeing somebody trying to count individual grains of rice is easier to remember than being told rice is an uncountable noun. Storytelling. One of the best ways to introduce the past simple is through a story. Use well-known traditional tales or make up your own to suit the grammar point. Songs, chants, and poems are used all over the world. These are also great ways to practice grammar. They're memorable and provide lots of repetition. Try fitting new words to traditional tunes like Old MacDonald Had a Farm. TPR, or total physical response. A great way of practicing imperatives or prepositions with children is by playing a game of Simon Says. The value of total physical response lies in the fact that young children are not able to cope with abstract concepts, but rely on their senses to learn new things. Physically doing something helps the child to understand the language. The difference, say, between reading this sentence in a book, John is opening the window, and actually performing the task for yourself is immense. Using TPR also means that you can instantly change the pace of your lesson. If your children are getting tired or restless, a physical activity can re-energize them. For older learners, you can use picture differences, class surveys, etc. So the following slides are examples of chants and poems you can use in a grammar lesson for young learners. Look at this particular chant. What grammar structure does it practice? You've probably guessed it's practicing can for ability. Get the students to put on a special metallic robot voice as they sing or chant. They'll enjoy it all the more. This traditional rhyme can be used to introduce children to the past simple. Look at any book of children's verses, and you're sure to find poems which give you opportunities either to present or practice grammar. Alternatively, you can quite easily make up your own rhymes or poems. The advantage of this, of course, is that it enables you to target the very point you wish to teach. Here's another poem that can be used to introduce prepositions. And finally, we come to stage 8, consolidation and recycle. Remember that children learn language quickly, but equally forget it quickly. Teachers need to help them understand and remember the structures better. Use different activities or games using the same grammar in different contexts. As mentioned before, personalized activities make language more meaningful and memorable. Let learners use the structures to talk about their interests and their lives. Try to use the learned structures as much as possible in your daily communication with your learners. There are 3 ways we can approach teaching grammar. It can be prescriptive grammar, descriptive, or pedagogic. Have you heard of these terms before? Prescriptive grammar is about how we should speak or write or use language in the strictest sense of the word. It can be useful, but also quite restricting. Descriptive grammar describes what native speakers actually say, rather than what someone thinks they should say. People often say, "There's a lot of people in China," for example. It's not technically right, but it still sounds normal, and no one would really bat an eyelid if a native speaker said it. But should we teach this? Ultimately, probably not. Descriptive grammar is often too complex for language learners, with too many unpredictable variables. Pedagogic grammar is the kind of grammar you'll find in student grammar books. This consists of simple, manageable rules according to level. Pedagogic grammar is probably best suited to our needs as teachers, as it keeps the language we teach within practical parameters for our learners. There are a huge number of online resources for teaching grammar, but for the purposes of your teaching practice on this course, we can direct you to these 2 sites, which will come in useful for when you need to plan your own grammar lessons in preparation for the face-to-face. So to sum up, drilling helps making language use automatic, which is our ultimate goal for our students, to have them reach a level of comfort and automaticity where they don't have to think too hard about what they wish to say, thereby achieving a certain level of fluency. Make sure you do try to implement this when you teach a grammar lesson. We should not teach about language, but how to use language. In other words, focus on how we can best provide our students with the opportunity and the tools to communicate using the target language. Language should be used for communication in a natural and meaningful way, and so the activities we choose to include in our lessons, especially for freer practice, should reflect this. It's more memorable to have learners discover the grammar rules by themselves, and so we do try to encourage you to use the inductive approach. Actions can help a lot in learning language, especially with young learners, so see what element of kinesthetic tasks you can include when practicing the target language. In the next section, if possible, focus on trying to implement the recommended staging for an upcoming grammar lesson you might have. Use the information in this input and plan carefully. You're going to discuss these aspects of grammar teaching in your next OT. By now, you should be fairly familiar with what you need to prepare. So organize your notes, highlight key information, concepts, and terms you've learned. Prepare any questions or comments that you want to raise with the group. And if you are able to incorporate any of these ideas in your teaching, please make some notes of any insights that you wish to share. Thanks for watching, and see you at the next OT.